Hey, welcome to Foolproof Theology. My name is Chase Davis, and I am your host. It's good to be with you here today. Hey, I just wanted to remind you I've got a link to my Patreon in my bio and on the show notes. So head over there, join up on the Patreon. We got people joining up there, which is great. Love the support. I've got even people from my church signed up, which is fun just because I get to talk to them in person about what kind of content they want to bring to bear on their lives on the podcast. And so if you want to interact with me on the Patreon, that's great. You can sign up there and interact, and that'd be a great way to connect. Today's episode, we've got a guest who I was actually a guest on his podcast called Ars Politica. I'd highly recommend it. It's one that I like to listen to when I work out. It's great content, just talking about political philosophy and other cultural matters related to Christianity. They have a great intro that's very, I can't remember the band that he's got there, but I love the band. And then they talk about restoring the dignity of like Western heritage. And I just think that's a wonderful way to intro. But Stephen, thank you so much for being on the show today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So Stephen Wolfe is a postdoctoral, is that how it works, fellow at the James Madison Institute at Princeton University. Is that correct?
Yeah, I will be that for another 20 days. I've been doing that for the last, about 11 months, and I'll be finishing up end of August.
Okay, cool. And then do you know what's coming next?
Now, I mean, you can see behind me those boxes. We just moved into a house in central North Carolina. And I'm just gonna start calling myself the country scholar.
Country scholar.
So I'll be teaching online for a couple colleges and also a high school course through Kepler .education. And so that's what I'm gonna do, and do a little bit of farming and that sort of thing. So
that sounds great, man.
Yeah.
And then you got your degree in 2020 from LSU in political philosophy. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay, and I have to ask because I went to Texas A&M. Did you develop a deep love for LSU, or was this just kind of like, this is my degree and I'm going to get out of here? What was that like for you?
I was never like a college football guy, and it was having gone to West Point for undergrad, where football was something you were forced to love, or just sports in general, even when the team was terrible. And so, but going to LSU, I guess it was more about the fact that the program had conservatives, professors, and a kind of a legacy of conservatism. So that's mainly why I was there. I did come to enjoy some of the baseball, LSU baseball. But the main love was just the people who were there in my department. That's the main thing.
And then at the James Madison Institute, we have something called the Benson Center up at CU Boulder. And so was the James Madison Institute kind of a conservative group of people? I think it's led by Robert somebody. I can't remember his name.
Yeah, Robert George.
Led by?
Yeah, Robert George. So the James Madison Program. I might have said institute in another somewhere accidentally, but it's a James Madison Program at Princeton University, and I don't think it doesn't kind of sell itself as conservative. It's more of a free speech kind of viewpoint diversity. But generally speaking, the network are people who are conservative and religious. So you'll have Roman Catholic Protestants, people who are Jewish, and so and it's really nice because if you're more, I guess, outspokenly conservative, it's a sort of place that offers great funding and great support and friendships and collaboration for people who just finished up their PhD. So it's a great program. They have great events. So if you're in the New Jersey, central New Jersey, check it out. That's
great. Well, the main thing I wanted to get you on the podcast today was to talk about this concept of Christian nationalism and kind of to set the stage. There's kind of a debate, you could say, going on, a discourse where you've got people that are kind of landing in different ways. And recently I saw people like Al Mohler, Doug Wilson, just own the term Christian nationalism. And then you've got on the other side, you've got lots of, people in higher ups in evangelicalism denouncing Christian nationalism. Hopefully going to have a guest on later this year who has specifically written a book against Christian nationalism. And so I want to at least hear his perspective and and get him on here. But you have a book coming out with Canon Press that is on Christian nationalism. Is there a title for that book yet, Stephen?
No, not yet. I don't want to say yet, but
That's
no,
fine.
there's not.
It is on
I
Christian
think-
nationalism, though.
I think, it's a defense of Christian nationalism. I don't know if that'll be the subtitle or whatever, but yeah, that's the topic. That's
Great. So what I wanted to get Stephen on here for is basically because I'm going to have a guest on later this year that's basically against Christian nationalism. And if you wanted to go, pick up a good example of this would be like Paul Miller's latest book. And of course, what they want to try to do is repurpose the word patriotism and say that's the good one, that Christians can do that. Nationalism is wicked. I've seen people call it demonic, that kind of thing. And what I wanted to get Stephen on here to do is basically say, give me the case for not necessarily nationalism, but Christian nationalism. So I guess let's start out with maybe a definition, if that would be helpful, Stephen.
Okay.
How would you describe Christian nationalism?
Yeah. Well, because I'm an academic, let me talk about definitions first.
Yeah.
In general, when people are trying to define Christian nationalism, you see mainly from you see if they have good faith and they're trying to actually describe something in the world, that's a kind of approaching it from the bottom up, as in they're saying there's some phenomenon in the world that's occurring, and there's these people who believe these things. So, and they say, I want to capture these people and those people under this term. So it's like in other words, it's like the extension of the term. It extends or applies to this group of people.
Yeah.
And that's a fair way to do it. I mean, social scientists do that sort of thing all the time. So there's nothing wrong with that in itself. And so a lot of times people, they're also trying to use the term with connotations that are very negative. So they assume from the outset, this is bad. And their intent is clearly to describe something in such a way that it makes certain people, usually their political enemies, look bad.
Yeah, so like you can see this with the term like evangelical even becoming a more social science political term that's typically trying to, disparage certain beliefs and certain people within the nation. Would that be a fair kind of analogy?
Yeah. So because among a certain crowd, mainly people on the center or on the left, or kind of moderates in the left, the word nationalism sounds bad, and then you add Christian to it, and it sounds like, well, you're trying to throw us back into medieval times or whatever. So whatever it is, it sounds to them like a combination of Nazism and like something that violates our founding principles,
right?
And that's more the negative approach to it. And I think so. What I try to do in my book is I try to take the words Christian nationalism and kind of denote what those mean. So I start at more, I guess you could say, the theoretical level, instead of going down and finding cases like, okay, here's this guy believes this guy believes, let's call them. It's more like it's the term is Christian nationalism. So this combines kind of a set of words. Obviously there's nation in there, and then there's nationalism, then there's Christian nationalism. It seems also imply Christian nation. So what do all those terms mean? And so I kind of walk through what I affirm about what those words mean. And I start with nation, and then I say, okay, what composes, what makes a nation? What's the ism of nationalism? So you have this nationalism. What does that ism really refer to? At least as I understand it. And then how does Christianity, or the Christian nationalism, how does Christian modify the word nationalism? And I think I have a more complex definition in the book that probably wouldn't suit well for this format, but I think to put it concisely, it's a Christian nation acting for itself, self-conscious, conscious of itself as Christian, as a Christian people, and they act for their earthly and heavenly good. Okay. So so think of like a people in terms of a nation. They self-identify as a people. but they're Christian, so they identify as a Christian people, and we can talk about what that means as well. But then the ism refers to, you can almost think of it as like the program. That's not really precise enough. The national program of sorts to bring about your national good, which includes your heavenly good,
right?
Or grace. It includes a sort of directing the nation to heavenly life, not as a nation, but as individuals. That's, but that's the idea. And so I think that definition, I think, is, even though people think, well, I thought nationalism has something to do with fascism and all that.
Yeah.
And I think people will be surprised. There's plenty of stuff they won't like about the book, but I think they'll be surprised that my definition probably, like, people think of nationalism, they think of like 19th century, as a development 19th century. It resulted from maybe like the French Revolution and other things. And some people wanted to, like, Yoram Hazony wants to take it back to like the 15th century and all that. But really my definitions would actually extend out through much of history. Okay. So in that sense, I don't think it would be too controversial in itself, or people. I'd say it's more ahistorical, meaning it's not located from a certain century. It's actually extremely common human way of organizing themselves.
Yeah, and part of the reason,
minus the Christian part, but the nationalism itself is something very common for people to kind of organize themselves and act for themselves.
For sure. But I think part of the reason it's so controversial is it's getting a lot of heat from the press, kind of major publications are publishing pieces to signal to just normal people, hey, this is a term that's bad. You don't want to be associated with it. And then they try to paint it onto certain groups and associate certain figures with it. And so I think part of the reason I wanted to have you on is, I don't know that, like, I listened to Aaron Renn's podcast yesterday on, I think he talked about nationalism. He talked about basically the term being, kind of nascent in the 20th century. And, is it useful? It's a useful game to play because it helps build alliances, and because certain groups, New York Times and such, are using it almost as a slander or a curse. Of course, there's people that will want to go, well, fine, that is what we are, and that's kind of the attitude, which I totally get that. That's an interesting game to play in kind of the culture we're in. But you're suggesting that this, what you're trying to do is repackage the term, or maybe not repackage. You're just trying to come up with a definition that's more, hey, these are common principles that nations and peoples have always had. Would that be fair to say?
Yeah, that's exactly. But I should say that I do think that places like the New York Times and Washington Post should be afraid of Christian nationalism because it does directly oppose them. So I'm not trying to please them. I'm not trying to say, oh, no, it's really not that bad. No, for them, it is bad. I mean, I'll say that straight up. It directly opposes their ideology. So, I mean, I understand. It's understandable why publications like that and people who align on that side of things would be concerned with it. And I think Christians should say, yeah, you should be concerned. I mean, not as like a threat of, violence or whatever, but as, yeah, I mean, if we win, this is what we're going to do. And so they should be concerned if they don't like that, even though it is good. I mean, to us, it is actually good. We're not asserting some kind of, situational, it's what we're asserting. This is universally good, but yeah, to them, it would be bad. So they are right to react in that way. But I mean, my argument is that this is common throughout history. That is the sort of nationalism I'm defining as I define it. And the Christian nationalism is just ordering your nation in light of the gospel. So it doesn't eliminate many of all nations are going to be different, distinct according to certain cultural practices that are not distinctively Christian, like language. So you'll have this nation will have that language, another nation will have another language, some, different dialects. Those things are not distinctively Christian. There's no Christian language, but but these nations can, like, retain their language of English or Spanish or whatever, but they can still be Christian. And Christian meaning, I think, principally that they support the church, not necessarily have an established church like in England, but have some kind of support for true religion as it's found in various assemblies and denominations, and that's the principle. But also, I think the people themselves will look at each other just in a social way, as on the streets, and as a community, as a people, as fellow Christians as well. So there'd be social aspects, social custom, social expectations that are separate from law, civil law, and the magistracy, but still support a Christian people and the institutions.
Would that include the exclusion of, and I think this is where kind of the tension starts to hit, would it include the exclusion of certain benefits for certain religious groups?
It doesn't necessarily have to.
Okay.
In principle, it could, meaning that it's possible. It's not wrong in itself.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's complex. I don't want people to kind of misunderstand.
Sure.
Because you can have a tradition, like in the American tradition, since before and after the founding, was to extend a lot of toleration. So I think America was a Christian nation, as a people, at least. I think the Constitution should have had something more to say about God.
Sure.
But I think as a people, as a nation, it was Christian, and we've understood ourselves as such for a long time until recently. But at the same time, there was toleration for for Jews, for example, and at times there was kind of suppression of Roman Catholicism. But in general, I think you could say that the tradition is one of toleration. Now, how that plays itself out in every context and every set of circumstances will kind of differ.
Yeah.
So I think, for example, like a public school can be a Christian public school, and they can have like a Christmas play or something like that, around Christmas time. And I think it'd be wrong to force anyone to participate. Mm-hmm. But I do not think it would be wrong for them to deny other religious groups the right to do their own plays on public support. Sure. Now that's controversial. So I'm saying it's not wrong in itself. Now they could, because we have to live in peace with our fellow man, and we have to, sometimes by acting against people we disagree with or think that it's actually destructive for us and themselves, we actually cause a greater problem in our action. So if we're aiming at some end, sometimes we have to tolerate or even extend full liberty in order to achieve the end we're seeking after. But I think my point, and probably the most controversial one, is I don't think it's wrong in principle to do those sorts of exclusions.
Yeah, and the irony is, when I was overseas as a missionary, I was in an Islamic country, a Muslim country, and they all perceived America as a Christian nation, and I was very against that, just as a defense mechanism, because I was like, well, that's not true. I mean, these aren't real Christians. They would associate Britney Spears and all these pop stars as Christians, and I was like, they're not. That's not Christianity. But now, 10 years later, I'm going, okay, so like we as Americans typically look at Saudi Arabia, and they're kind of like dominant Muslim hegemony, and how you're not allowed to like do certain things there. But none of us are going over there to say we should start a war with them, because that's against the liberal order. We allow them to live out their convictions in their political system. And we view that as almost acceptable for them. But then there's a double standard applied to ourselves, where we say if we were to suggest such a project, well, that would be wrong based on some kind of principles of a modern liberal order. And that was kind of a huge disconnect I had at least 10 years ago.
Yeah. So when I was in the Army, I did this officer training that was a kind of extended training, 3 or 4 months training. And there were 2 Saudi Arabian officers they're Saudi Arabian citizens, and they were there for their training, and after they finished, they would go back to Saudi Arabia. At the end of it, the last day, I brought each of them a Bible in Arabic. And the younger guy, he looked appreciative and he was nice and friendly. He was kind of a sort of guy I expect is driving convertibles around right now. He seemed like that kind of guy. And the other guy was older, and I handed it to him. He touched it, and he acted almost as if it was like a hot potato. I don't know that was sacrilegious for me to even touch it. Yeah. And he was kind of offended by it. They didn't do anything. I never saw him again, and I never got death threats from him. But they took him and they didn't give him back. But I was chastised by this female American officer for doing that, and she was very offended on their behalf that I would do that and offend them. So it just kind of shows that there is this kind of bizarre double standard that no place in America is allowed to have anything other than this very modern, liberal, secularist approach to things. That we're foolish if we believe that some things are sacrilegious and profane and shouldn't be done in certain contexts. But and we believe in more hierarchical or traditional norms. And yet here she's just utterly offended, aghast that I would hand them a book that's probably, I'd say abused to let her. Well, anyway, but yeah, I mean, there's clear double standards that happen today, and it's pretty bizarre if you think about it. And I mean, I don't like throwing out the term, but it's almost slightly like racist. It's a sense that like as white people, we ought to have these certain, like we ought to be liberal, and they are superior, and yet at the same time we shouldn't do anything that offends the non-liberal customs of outsiders.
No, that's exactly right. I mean, I actually listened to Joe Rogan on this, and he talked about how it was a joke, of course. He was doing sketch comedy, and the joke was on, if we go find a tribe in the wilderness and they're not white, then it's like, you got to leave them alone. Like they're allowed to kill us if we interfere with them, and that's totally fine. But if you go find like this, he described it as like this wild band of white people in Washington, and they've never been discovered before, how we would want to bring them into the liberal order, and we would want to civilize them. And it was just he highlighted this duplicity, this attitude that we have that is subtly racist, which is really ironic considering the accusations, forwarded the other way.
Whereas conservatives and the right, I mean, I don't want to live like Saudi Arabia. I don't want to live like that. I don't want to live like Iraq. Right. Trust me, I don't want to live anything like that, or Afghanistan. I don't want to be a jihadist. Right. I kind of like the American way of life. Yeah. There are aspects to it that need to be corrected, and the things that the people who want to somehow love, they somehow, like the sort of the woman who chastised me for giving Bibles to Saudi Arabians. What she believes, I'd like to, destroy in the United States, but I like the American way of life, and but at the same time, these people they want to enforce really insane notions upon us. And I think as Christians, we should want an American Christian nation that is distinct, that is truly American and truly Christian. And we seek to preserve and conserve, to establish and then conserve that.
Yeah, and I think that's where you start to run into the tension. And I want to hear your perspective on this in just a second. But the tensions a lot of people feel with the term, it seems, around the historicity of America as a Christian nation. So that's one argument that needs to be made, because typically it's an argument that's held in high derision. At least among my pastor friends and other people, as soon as you start trying to talk about America being a Christian nation, Hamilton and Jefferson and blah, blah, blah. So like, that's one argument that I don't really, I mean, if you want to talk about it, we can, but the other one is like giving a vision for Christians or people of what would it be like if a nation were to embody such a society, or if a people were to own their kind of, not just their history, but okay, not only is the history, it's relevant, but what would it look like moving forward? Just accept the fact that you are a Christian. You want good for your neighbor. What would be good for your neighbor? For them to live in a Christian world. And so we should want to further a Christian world, the kingdom of God. We pray that, and we should live that out. And this runs headlong into a different vision. So why, when you say the New York Times, Washington Post, these kind of institutions, they feel threatened or whatever, why is it that they feel threatened by this concept?
Well, I mean, it just directly opposes many of the things that they believe. So the obvious thing would be the sexual norms are threatened. It also violates what they perceive to be the requirement for neutrality, like moral neutrality between different groups. Of course, that's completely bogus. They use neutrality to actually push their own ideology, their heavily moralized ideology. And also it just cuts them completely from power. I mean, in a Christian nation, generally speaking, the people who are powerful would be expected to be Christian, at least in name, or at least nominally, or at least they would publicly support that nation as Christian.
Right.
And since they are not Christian and do not want to act as if they are, and do not want to contribute to that sort of project, it threatens their power. So I think that's one of the reasons. I mean, going back, if I may, to like the America as a Christian nation.
Yeah.
I mean, this could be a whole podcast on itself. But
right.
What's odd about that discussion is one, it's usually full of ignorance. And I say that not because I disagree, but because I just think it's just straight up ignorance. Even someone like John Fee, who's kind of I don't want to call him liberal. I think politically he's pretty liberal. I don't know theologically where he's at, but he's a historian and he writes on these things. He's just straight up said, like, 19th century Americans basically all affirmed that they were Christian. I mean, that the Christian nation, and this is, and in some ways the late 19th and early 20th century disputes between kind of progressives and the different Christian factions of the time. It was a dispute over, well, what sort of Christian nation are we going to become? So the more social gospel types are like, America's a Christian nation. Well, we ought to live like it. So here's the social gospel. Mm-hmm. So it was, and then the like post World War II. With the Eisenhower administration, these were really real, like concerted efforts. In that sense, it was more political to kind of shore up America as a Christian nation. But before that, I mean, it was just understood. And I think the folks that you met in, I forget what country you said, them saying that the United States is a Christian nation or Americans are Christians is in one sense true, because to anyone who doesn't have some sort of political issue with that, they're just going to affirm that because historically it has been. Yeah. And the founding itself, that's probably a different discussion. But I think that it's just the dismissive attitude to saying that's a Christian nation is just usually done out of a sort of ignorance. Yeah. But I think also that the next thing is that there is a sort of thing called what I would call like the post-work, and I didn't call it this. Not Aaron Wren. Rusty Reno calls it the kind of this post-war consensus.
Okay.
So after World War II, there was kind of agreement among intellectuals in America and Europe that we can't ever have World War II happen again. And so it said, politics needs to be as non-dogmatic as possible. It should be multicultural. We should not have what Reno calls the strong gods of kind of a robust conception of what is good, not only along strictly natural moral lines, but also customs and the sense of us. Like that we can't have a strong sense of us.
Right. And
I think Christians nowadays blindingly are kind of enmeshed in that understanding, which is fairly new. I think it's very new. And before World War II, it was far more common for people to say, well, this is what we are and this is what we ought to be and remain.
Yeah.
Of course, correct what's bad. And Christians historically, I mean, just you think of the history of the church, not even Protestant, but, prior to Protestantism, the predominant tradition is of a civil polity of a people, affirming that they're Christian and then acting accordingly through their civil institutions to that end.
Right.
And that's largely that's largely what I mean by Christian nationalism. And so I think that our spirit to see Christianity established and sustained is just been deadened by being the last several decades of thinking that we can't be assertive in this way. And this really has surfaced clearly in conservatism, because the conservative mindset for decades has been, all right, you're a little strange, but we'll just leave each other alone.
Sure.
And you just leave me alone. Here we have these freedoms, and I have religious liberty. You can go be goofy and weird in San Francisco and Greenwich Village. Do what you got to do. It's weird to me, but don't move in next door. Don't read to my children in libraries.
Yeah.
So that there was that sense of, okay, there's always going to be some oddballs, but now we're seeing that that's not enough, and they're actually the liberals and the left are asserting their own moral ideology, and they're not going to leave us alone.
No, they're not.
And so we've been set up by, I think, just like post-war conservatism, to be exactly that, to kind of accept liberalism in its very basic form. We call it classical liberalism or whatever, neoclassical.
Yeah.
But then it set us up to actually not have this, this stop, like declaration, stop. This is enough.
Yep. I think that's important to point out, because kind of the general attitude of most conservatives seems to be, the Gadsden flag, don't tread on me, which isn't a sufficient political or even moral vision for that. And it seemed to be good enough until the ideologues really took over kind of media and entertainment and public education. And now all of a sudden, I think of the dichotomy I think of is between College Station, Texas and Austin. So Austin has the Keep Austin Weird shirts, or at least they used to. And it used to be okay because you had that kind of truce. Y'all do your weird thing there, but here we're going to do our own thing here, and we're our own people. Well, they're not content to stay there. They insist. Now, based on a lot of different reasons, I would say it's almost a primal instinct to replicate, to dominate, and to reproduce, because they're not going to, because they believe in abortion and all these kind of things. They have a desire to proliferate their ideas. You're not just going to keep your ideas in one spot. And so I think what you're suggesting, and the kind of disposition that maybe you're provoking, not to be a provocateur, but what if instead of Christians having this attitude of, yeah, keep Austin weird, that's fine, in fact, it's kind of cool, what if we made shirts or adopted slogans like "Make Austin Christian," which is what any church planner would want. We would want our city to be filled with Christians, and yet they seem so scared of that kind of like approach, because they want to go into the city and kind of be learners and all this kind of stuff. And it's like, no, I want Boulder to be more Christian. Like, why is that? Why should I apologize for that?
Yeah. I mean, on our podcast, Thomas Acord is my co-host. We sometimes would just like, when we talk about these issues, it's like, wouldn't you, even if they're nominal Christians, wouldn't you want those people to be your neighbors? I mean, when you have kids, I just wonder. I wonder if like childlessness in the church, how much that's going to affect this. Because when you have kids, I mean, if you got some people next door and they don't agree with them, I mean that's fine. But if you have kids and then they have kids, like we just move to a new place, and we're kind of like, well, there's some people back there, and they have kids similar to our kids' age, but then you walk up and the kid's got purple hair. And maybe the kid likes purple hair, and there's nothing wrong with it, but it's one of those indicators that you want to just like, I got to ask more questions.
Exactly.
Here. Because if my kid goes over there, I don't know. It also used to be the case when I grew up. I remember having friends, and now he's a goofy liberal, but he was a good friend of mine, and his mom was very liberal. But that never came up. Like, politics wasn't a thing.
Right.
He and I just liked football and watched, San Francisco Giants baseball. That's what we did.
Yeah.
But nowadays, if I sent my kid over there, I don't know what sort of thing that they get caught up in, or not get caught up, but influence in. So
Yeah, I know what you mean.
everything's kind of, so why wouldn't you want to live in a country or a neighborhood that's people who are Christian in some capacity, and that just seems ideal, but everyone's really afraid for that sort of thing to happen.
Yeah.
They're afraid that, they're afraid that makes Christianity look like it's because things are required for this. There's social expectations, which requires a certain force to them, certain, side glance. Mm-hmm. There's exclusion that's required, maybe exclusion with a lot of manners,
Sure.
but nevertheless, it's a clear exclusion.
Right.
There might be some distrust towards people who are then different.
Right.
And those things are something we'd have to actually accept. There'd be there'd be outsiders.
But I think that
to that norm.
I think that
right?
what you're
so
suggesting, though,
people don't want that.
Is that or at least what I'm saying is that's inevitable. Like, if you move to a secular context, right, people are going to exclude others and give side glances. And the kind of liberal facade of we're tolerant, everyone knows it's a farce. You move to a secular city and that's not true. And so I guess what makes Christians so uncomfortable is they've been sold kind of this vision of, tolerance and acceptance, and the idea of becoming an exclusive people, or a people that is willing to center themselves in the conversation. And that's an evangelistic tactic we're trying to inculcate. And Boulder, for example, is when people suggest certain ideas, you just blatantly say the opposite. If that's what's true of you, you don't have to be just provocative, but you just blatantly assume the opposite. And then you say, isn't it great to live in a great place that's so tolerant of different viewpoints? And then you hand them a beer and you move on with your life. But instead, a lot of Christians, based on a relational evangelism and these kind of approaches, they're used to oh gosh, that's the exact opposite of what I believe. And I'm just going to be quiet about it. And instead, what we're trying to suggest is no, they're obviously trying to exclude you. They're trying to set a normal discourse of this is what's acceptable here. And unless you kind of find a backbone and just say, yeah, I believe differently in that. That's pretty cool that we can get along, huh? And you center that, and you try to not poke the bear to poke the bear, but you're disorienting and exposing their own hypocrisy in it.
Yeah, that's like an evangelistic method when you're kind of the minority, when you yourself are the outsiders. Yeah. And I think that's privileged. You can see from the early church, you can see the church fathers basically mocking and the paganism. Yeah. There's a funny part in City of God. I forget which book it is. He goes on. Augustine goes on for pages and pages on making fun of how many gods the Romans have. And he's like, there's a god of the toe, and you also have fingers, so there's gonna be a god of the finger. It's just Augustine just mocking and kind of showing how it's ridiculous, and that can be done well or poorly, of course. But I'm just saying that you can have that more confrontational. No, you're wrong and hypocritical. But my vision for Christian nationalism is that sort of evangelism wouldn't have to occur.
Sure,
because it's so today in our world to accept homosexual marriage, for example, is easily accepted because people are in a sense socially engineered to accept it.
Yep.
And it's not only socially costly to reject it, it's also, I'd say, for most people, kind of psychologically difficult and costly, because it goes against basically your own inclinations, which is to affirm these people, and so in their relationships. And I don't think that in itself is wrong, meaning that you have inclinations towards certain things that are part of social custom, and you'd say engineering of sorts. That there should be in society an expectation that you will be Christian. Right. And what this does, I know people then say, well, this is just opens up every doors for hypocrisy, which of course it does. It does actually. But it also, what it does, it inclines you towards Christian beliefs as well. It inclines you to, in other words, it establishes the plausibility of Christian truth, of assent to Christian truth. And it would make it kind of psychologically challenging for you to reject it. In fact, you'd have to feel like an outsider and against the norm and all that. Right. And of course, I think that's not to say that social, that this sort of social force will make you a Christian, in the same way that civil power, like a magistrate, cannot command you to believe and to put faith in Christ. But it does at least make that first step in conversion more natural to you and plausible. That is the assent to Christian truth. Because as good Protestants, we know that you have to assent to truth, and you have to but in order to be saved, you have to place your faith, the actual faith in Christ. So faith and assent to truth are somewhat separate things. So my point is that all this Christian nationalism, I understand, will then lead people to the assent, and then it also brings the Word of God within the family, within society, and it encourages church attendance, and that's where people receive the kind of the preaching of the Word of God for faith.
Yeah.
But I mean, on hypocrisy, I'm sorry, but like I said, like for hypocrisy is going to happen because you're going to have people who just kind of claim to believe who don't. But I think the thing is, that's actually one that's good for society generally. That it's not good for the person as in terms of their soul, right, but it's good for society. And because even someone who is not a Christian in heart but Christian outwardly can still contribute to the salvation of people who are to inwardly. So a society like that is actually better. And so, but the role of the role of the Word of God is in society, family, and church is to convert souls, whereas the role of kind of civil order in society is to order that outwardly for those things.
That makes sense, and I think that's the biggest fear a lot of people have with nationalism, Christian nationalism. Is the one thing I hear is, cultural Christianity is the worst, nominal Christianity is the worst. And I always try to, whenever I'm in conversation with people that are really aggravated by that vision, that nominalism or hypocrisy could increase, I'm like, well, what do you think was going to happen, man, if your evangelism actually works? Like if your prayers for your city actually work and more people become Christians, by proportionality, nominalism will increase. You will only increase nominalism if you're actually effective. And of course you can't, it's not just on you, God saves souls. So it's not suggesting that that's in our hands, but it is to suggest you have not thought through the consequences of your own actions and what that will result in, because that's inevitable. It is inevitable if we want to reach people, that there will be people who come in who are not really Christians or maybe hypocritical or whatever it is. That's just what's going to happen.
Yeah, like Thomas, my co-host and friend, he likes to say, "Well, what happens if you succeed? What happens if there is a revival? What do you do now?"
Yep.
Because we have this frame that we approach everything from the frame of perpetual outsider, and all of a sudden, well, what if like the king or the civil leader who has certain powers, what happens if he does listen and he does convert to Christ? Now what? Yeah. And then usually people resort to saying there's just some sort of liberal line of, well, he should still.
What you're just talking about is why would you not want that? Why would you not want to succeed? Is that what you're kind of getting at?
Yeah, like what? Yeah. Well, not only that, just that. Yeah, if you're successful, why wouldn't? Well, what are you going to do now? You know, if you're in a town that's mainly Christian, are you seriously not going to have or organize your town around Christian things? I mean, and support that. It's. I guess the people could of course some people could bring principles as to why you shouldn't do that. But again, you have to wonder why you would resort back to this kind of liberal neutrality when the majority of you are outwardly Christian. Yeah. So it's
for sure. I kind of wanted to close out talking about masculine discourse. This is something you've written on. In fact, my joke, in my head at least, is I hope I never cross swords on Twitter with Stephen Wolfe. And inevitably, I think I will. I'm sure there's going to be something. It'll probably be like paedobaptism and covenant theology, and how my Baptist inclinations are inconsistent with, a vision for a Christian nation. But I notice when you engage with people, it's very plain and direct. And you've written on masculine discourse and feminine discourse in Christianity. Mm-hmm. And so I wanted to kind of drop some I don't know, help people kind of see what you're talking about there. When you talk about feminine discourse and how a lot of discourse has been feminized, what are you describing there?
Yeah. So when I think of masculine discourse, I think of two, I guess as a sort of example, it'd be two guys who are analytically and systematically, you could say, duking it out verbally. You know, they're fighting over something. And it can be, it doesn't have to be, I guess it could be get personal, but it's and there can be an audience, so people are watching you, and you obviously want the audience to win, or you want to win over the audience, right? Yeah. Because oftentimes when you're debating a guy, you can assume that your interlocutor is not going to change his mind, but there might be those handful of people observing who will. Right. And so that's often what you're getting for. But this, that's true for whether it's women or men. But in masculine discourse, it's more of you versus him in the conversation. And the idea is that the force of your argumentation will achieve the end of persuasion or bringing someone else to. Yeah, so it's more of you versus him, and that's it. Even though the audience is around you, it may not be fair to say that's masculine discourse. It may just be better to say that men tend to are drawn towards that type of discourse.
That makes sense.
Whereas, because certainly women can do that as well. I don't want to say they don't, but there is, I'd say, like a feminine, and maybe you could say it's toxic feminine. Maybe that'd be a better way to categorize it. That where they wield like a third party in the discussion, and used femininity as a ground for their argument, or a reason or a basis for their argument, or what they're trying to say. Okay. And so they will, and this often appeals to men. So like a woman will say something, says like, "Oh, you're attacking me because I'm a woman," or you've offended me, and it'll be often not necessarily emotional, but it'll be the sort of thing of, how dare you disagree with me, that sort of thing. And in doing that, the other guy could be like, if it's just you and her alone, you're just like, I guess, well, I'm not going to get anywhere with this. But if it's on places like Twitter or other places, the offense that it could be a guy does this too, but generally it's women. The offense that she receives or expresses is then observed by often other men and women, who then come to her aid against the person. So the other guy could be completely right. Literally his argument could be a syllogism, boom, boom, conclusion. But because something about that offended her, instead of her having to respond by saying it's invalid or denying a premise, she could just express offense, or, oh, another guy's attacking me again, or something like that. Sure. And you get all these other dudes coming in saying, you're a jerk, stop abusing. And the other women saying, you go girl. And so you have that's what I mean by kind of like feminized discourse. It's this third,
Gotcha.
it's kind of like third partyism. We talked about third party before, but
Yeah, right.
it's this thing where you appeal to something outside of yourself as like the way to get at your opponent. So instead of the force of your ideas as yourself against another person,
Right.
it's you appealing to these others, usually by emotion or some feminine aspect or effeminacy, whatever it is. And then they come alongside you to kind of be accusatory towards her opponent.
Yeah, it's a
and-
triangulation of the conflict, and it's a way to try to build a coalition on your side that's more
Right.
focused on self-preservation rather than an outward defense. And I think there's connections here to the nature of men and women, right? Where women are by nature God's designed to give birth, to nurture, to do these kind of things, and men by design aren't hardwired for those particular activities. And I think there's certain ways that those present themselves as we relate to other people. You can't flatten Christianity to some androgynous pursuit of holiness. There's going to be ways that particularly men and women cultivate holiness. And so when men particularly submit themselves to a feminized, and whether you there's we could probably parse out the difference between more of a feminist discourse and just a feminized discourse that's just more feminine. But when men do that, like, this is why I see universities and seminaries scrapping debate, because it pits two ideological opponents against one another, and we should see who wins. And I'm like, this is great, we should do that. But seminaries have become so feminized that they're like, well, that's not helpful for building unity. It's divisive to have debate. And I'm like, this is so dumb.
Yeah, I mean, but it might be better to say to this just effeminate discourse, because you see this with people like Kyle Howard.
Yeah.
So it's just not just women, but it's often like race hustlers, to be honest. And so it's people like Kyle Howard and sometimes Anthony Bradley. And in general, so very much like those, those sorts of people, plus a lot of women will do this online. So, yeah, I mean, yeah, it's, but I think for women, this third party idea I think it's ingrained in them, somewhat natural, because they're by nature kind of vulnerable, because they're more dependent. Men are by nature more independent. They can kind of assert themselves as individual beings kind of in the world, whereas women, because they're smaller and less muscular and almost don't really have a dominating disposition to them. They're going to depend. They're going to kind of cling to their husband or to their brothers or to their father as a support for them. So they're very dependent in that regard. Generally speaking. Nowadays they're less dependent because they have the modern state, or right. I should say they are just as dependent, but now they rely on the modern state.
That's
and that means you can, and also administrators and HR. So they still have the third parties. It's just not these natural relations. It's now these artificial bureaucratic relations that they use that they depend upon.
Mm-hmm.
But just take the husband. So that one of the things is, if a woman is kind of bound in a sense to her husband, that is as a wife, she would I think often by nature would want these other intermediate authorities to kind of control him. And this is actually pretty rational, because if he's bigger than her, he can physically harm her.
Yeah.
So she would want the state. She would maybe want like pastors. He can also get away with, philandering and all, and so you have these different authorities that they can then act as a third party to, in a sense, control his excesses that do her harm.
Sure.
That's all very understandable. But I think with that mindset, when women enter debate, they can often, not always, but they can often have that same inclination, but use like the crowd as that third party that then beats down this oppressor. So that's how I see a lot of feminine discourse. This is why I know several people who, they don't say this publicly, but they will say they don't engage women in social media and debates for this very reason, unless they know him well and they know they won't do this.
Sure.
And I also know women who don't like this as well. They hate that this happens. So,
Right.
I think calling something masculine a feminized discourse, it can kind of get it's probably not the most precise thing to say, but there definitely are these tendencies. And I think effeminate discourse is probably the best, like I said, and that's because it reaches beyond just, many women. It goes in these other sorts of contexts as well.
Yeah. And the Bible talks about men should act like men, and that effeminate men are bad, and we tend to like I see pastors all the time prefer other translations when they come upon these passages, but it's just kind of like, it's right there. And so
like the word soft, I mean, is it feminine or soft? What else is, what other word is it?
I don't know. They just totally scrap them in. Like, they'll use a different translation altogether that just, whether the Message or whatever, that just glosses over completely the Greek, which plainly says act like men. My joke, of course, was that, well, that's all, the trans movement is just trying to embody the Bible. They're just trying to act like men. So, we should all.
I mean, one of the obvious examples, if people are thinking of examples, and I hate to bring her name up, is this always brings the very white knight people I'm talking about.
Sure.
Now, have I said white knight? White knight is that guy who shows up to defend the woman when she's offended.
Yeah.
So, I mean, you see this like with the Jesus and John Wayne book and Dumez, who last name's Dumez.
Mm-hmm.
Which the book itself is not that profound. I mean, I read it and I reviewed it. I didn't think it was anything special. I thought it wasn't. I think it was very activist and ideologically oriented. But all that, I don't want to get in and review that book. But it's very clear. I mean, there was a really tame but generally negative review by a guy. What's his name? John Wilson, maybe.
Okay.
What's his name? I forget his. I should know his name, John. Anyway, and even then, it was like, there was just, I'm so sorry. Some guys show up on Twitter. I'm so sorry this is happening to you. And what a jerk. And why are these guys so obsessed with you? And they must want to date you, or something like that,
Yeah.
And even though it was like the most, like I thought it was annoying because it was like placating. It was like walking on like around eggshells.
Yep.
And it was, we know it's going to be, he knew he was entering what we're calling effeminate or feminine discourse.
Yep.
And he's like,
he's trying so hard.
He's just walking around and trying so hard.
Yeah.
But you know what? It didn't, no. When you kind of stake your entire academic intellectual life on this third party appeal to these white knights and these others, sympathetic folks, every criticism is going to turn into that.
Yep.
And unfortunately, that's becoming even more. I mean, you saw this with some like evangelical women writing more feminist-oriented books.
Mm-hmm.
The same thing. You criticize them. You say this is that wrong. It's always like, woe is me. You guys are always attacking women, and you're obsessed with this or that, and you're toxic. And so it's. Whereas there's another podcast. I keep going on and on, but there was a podcast I listened to of Carl Trueman on his Mortification of Spin.
Yeah.
And this is back when Amy Bird was still on that show.
Nice.
And it was like one of those moments where Truman was like, I miss these days where like 10, 15 years ago when we just talked about justification and we talked about scripture and we talked about these theological ideas where that was what, and what he was saying is he liked the era of, let's call it masculine discourse.
Right.
Or it's premise, conclusion. And if you're going to criticize, you deny a premise or you say it's invalid.
Sure.
Other argumentation, so that's what it was about. And I remember Amy Bird responded with something like, well, but all these other things are very, very important. Something like
Mm-hmm.
that. And, of course he just kept going. But yeah, I mean, we've entered this era of like feminist discourse, and for men, it's very difficult. Very difficult. And I think that the whole social justice in general is very effeminate discourse. It's very much like, this is not just like my truth, but it's that if you disagree, you're racist.
Yeah.
If you disagree, you're a bigot. If you disagree, you're, whatever, worse.
Yeah, I think of this temptation even in the pulpit where pastors are tempted to adopt kind of a more effeminate intonation where the appeal, like rhetoric is a very interesting topic when you're trying to win people, convince people, show people the truth. So like there's a rightful pathos. We should be able to appeal to people on a certain level. But if your mode of discourse, your mode of preaching is effeminized, where it's always kind of bringing in triangulation, and you're trying to deal with conflict in the church, and you're trying to do a lot of stuff in the sermon that really doesn't have a place there. And instead of winning souls for Christ, convincing them of the truth of God, letting it rest heavy on them and preaching the mercy of Christ, it becomes this kind of like showmanship where we're either debating someone not in the room, or we're adopting certain just modes where we're not, it's not very masculine. In fact, the idea that a pastor would just get up and have a very flat tone. I listened to like a Peter Lightheart sermon recently. It was pretty just like, normal. Just, this is what it is. This is what we believe. And in most evangelicalism, people would be like, that's boring, or that's not, whatever they would say. And I'm like, that makes me sad. Like that to me is very acceptable and actually very refreshing because I don't feel manipulated as I go.
That's true. Yeah, I think most people, that they don't even have that sense of manipulation.
Right.
They just feel like, oh, it's worked up and amen, I can tweet it
totally.
out. And we've gone to the point. I mean, the traditionally there's the logos, ethos, pathos type division in rhetoric,
right?
And we're on the side where we've dumped logos out.
Yep.
And now it's all about your credibility with the audience, which is often has really silly criteria to establish, or bad criteria. Yeah, and then like you said, pathos, and even the nature of the pathos is very much, like I said, the third party, bringing people alongside who are going to be accusatory and say, "Oh, you go, girl," whatever.
Yeah,
and those guys are jerks and. They're jerks for Jesus, and they're Theo bros and that kind of thing. So.
That's funny. Well, Stephen, this was great. Thanks so much for hanging with me today. I really hope we can get your book to have a wide audience when it comes out. Do you have any anticipated, or should we look for it next year, you think? Any idea?
I'm hoping October, but I don't know. It's they haven't given me a date yet.
Okay, cool. Well,
I'm hoping October.
I'll try to add this to the show notes whenever it drops, add a link to it, because I'm sure it'll be available soon. If you want to follow Stephen, you can go over to follow him on Twitter, @perfinjust.
That's right.
And then you can keep up with him that way. But he's doing a lot of great stuff, so you can keep up with him. And then, if you're a subscriber, or if you're not a subscriber, I should say, you should subscribe, sign up, click the notification icon. We've got a small little band of happy warriors that are subscribed, interacting, and I'd love for you to share this episode with a friend. Maybe you've got a friend who's totally captured by kind of this liberal, modern, secular approach to political engagement. Share it with them. Let us be the bad guys that break the news to them that they're might be wrong, and then you can have a conversation about it. So go buy them a beer, and then you can talk to them about it later. But do that, and then sign up in the Patreon. Any dollar amount helps. And until then, we will see you next time.